All righty, we've allowed a few minutes for folks to catch up with getting all logged in. On behalf of Jason Spiller and myself, James Steinbach, welcome to Front Range Front End tonight. Jason and I organize this event. You'll see him posting links in our chat here on Zoom that'll hopefully be helpful to you as you listen. We are really excited tonight to shift our format a little bit rather than just having a web person speak at everyone for 45 minutes or an hour. We're gonna have some Q&A, some interactive time, and I'm really delighted that we get to have Miriam Suzanne with us tonight. Miriam has been in front-end dev for quite a while, tremendous credentials with her work at Oddbird and other places, and currently she is one of the people contributing to CSS specification, and that's what we're gonna hear about tonight. What's new in the CSS specification, specifically around container queries, cascade layers, a number of details there. And yeah, this is going to be interactive. So as you have questions, I'll let Miriam lead how she likes for taking Q&A, opening it up, and facilitating the conversation. As a reminder, we do have a code of conduct that is linked from our meetup page. And to remind everyone of the short version, it is be kind to everyone, don't discriminate or be rude or unkind to anyone. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are recording this and we will, as soon as possible, get this up on the YouTube channel as a fixed event, a video there too. So without further ado, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Miriam, for leading our conversation, and please take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Is my audio okay? Hear me all right? Great. I'll share my screen here and yeah, that'll work. And I can't see you, so if you do want to interrupt and ask a question, you'll have to do a little more than raise your hand. But feel free to interrupt me. I'm going to cover basically an intro and 3 specs that we're talking about. And maybe I'll pause a little bit between them if there are immediate questions, but we can do bigger Q&A sort of at the end with all 3. So I'm going to be talking about the future of CSS, but in order to understand where we're going, we need to understand where we are now and how we got here. So in my mind, CSS exists for 2 primary reasons. The first is that CSS makes our styles responsive, and not just to the dimensions of the viewport, but also user preferences and device interfaces. When Sir Tim and the team at CERN released the first hypermedia browser, it was designed for the next machine with this fancy graphic interface at the time. But you can't make a web that's worldwide by saying it works on my machine and everyone else is an edge case. So right away, they released a second browser designed to work on any terminal with an internet connection. You didn't even have to download the browser. You could telnet into it. Because the mission statement of the web for all, web on everything, that becomes the mission of the World Wide Web Consortium. And that includes assistive devices and non-visual media, always with the end user in control of their experience. So when CSS does come along, we provide hints and suggestions, semantic clues, but only the browser actually has all the context to know what the interface is like, what the interface can do, what the user preferences are, and put it all together. And the Cascade describes that process by accepting style sheets from everyone involved. And that includes browsers and users establishing global defaults, and then preferences that apply across the entire web. And then we fill in the details for our particular site, the branding. And these are the primary Cascade origins, each one representing a different set of needs and concerns, different perspectives, and sometimes they're in conflict. And so what we use the term Cascade now to refer to is those rules of how we're going to merge all 3 together and resolve conflicts in that merge. By default, users override the browser defaults. So browsers set a default baseline style sheet. Users can override that with user preferences. And for better or worse, we're allowed to override everyone. But when things get really heated and when it really matters, the user and browser can insist that some things are more important than others. And that's the entire purpose of the important flag. It creates important origins that cascade in a reverse order. So that means important author styles are only slightly more important than our normal styles. We're still right there in the middle. And then important user preferences override us, and important user agent or browser styles can come along and say what's possible and what's not possible. And the second goal of CSS, in my mind, is to make our design objects reusable. So instead of repeating the same styles over and over in our HTML, we can use selectors to select all of those elements and apply styles more broadly, creating patterns based on things like classes and attributes, which we can combine to compose reusable objects, design systems, component libraries, etc. CSS has always been object-oriented at its core, but it's also declarative, contextual, resilient. These are features of the cascade. CSS is cascade-oriented. But selectors create another potential conflict for the cascade to resolve. Since we can use multiple different selectors to target the same element, the cascade needs to determine a winner again, like it did with origins. And we do that using a clever heuristic called specificity. And heuristic basically means it's an assumption. It's a good guess. And again, each selector type represents a different goal that gives us that heuristic. So the most generic selectors help us paint in broad strokes, establish low priority defaults, and then override those with classes and attributes that describe a little bit higher priority patterns that make up the majority of our styles. And at the high end, we get one-off IDs that are both most narrowly targeted and highest priority. So that heuristic tries to match up roughly how narrow is it targeted with then how high of a priority is it. And one ID will always override any number of attributes. These things layer down the list. It's not a perfect heuristic, but it's an approximation of the layers in our code. Until things start to get complicated and we run into a lot of problems, especially at scale. As our projects become larger, there are a lot of situations that don't quite fit those rules. Some low priority defaults can be very specific. These are from the Firefox default browser styles. And some generic attributes really ought to have more weight behind them. Hidden, we often throw important on something like that because we really want it to take more precedence. But out of all three of these four of these selector types, there's only one that we can customize and reuse, and that's classes and attributes. So we spend a lot of our time fighting over how many attributes should be in a selector with rules and conventions that ensure our cascade specificity matches carefully crafted layers of intent, building up from global abstractions to components and overrides. This is from Harry Roberts' inverted triangle, which I think gives a good visual of the problem. And then we throw importance like a grenade when we get stuck, or if one part of the system isn't playing by the rules. Sometimes we have to override because they've used specificity different than we do. So that brings us to the first new feature that we're going to talk about, Cascade Layers. Jen Simmons and I suggested this to the working group at the end of 2019, and it was approved last February to move into a spec. And right now, the spec is fairly stable. There's only one open issue, or one or two, and browsers are all on board. So hopefully we'll start seeing this implemented later in the year. Very similar to CSS origins, we're again creating these layers that represent different perspectives from different parts of a system, and giving them more explicit power to stack on top of each other. And potentially those can even come from different parts of our team. So we get to define these layers ourselves as authors for things like resets, defaults, frameworks, themes, components, utilities, anything we want in whatever order we need them to override. And the important flag works the same way that it does with origins. When it becomes necessary for a lower layer to insist on something and punch above its weight. So I think of utilities maybe falling into that category. They're sort of a default, but they're a high weight default. So we're not actually adding new origins here. This is all within our author origin, but it gives us sort of customizable layers of specificity, I think is a good way to think about it. And we can define a layer, give it a name, and add styles to it using either a layer function on the import rule or by nesting styles inside the new @layer rule, or both. So here we're creating a default layer with the headings.css import, and then using an @rule to add a few more styles to the same default layer. So we can add into a named layer multiple times. And these layers stack in the order that they were first defined, with the highest layer taking precedence. Sorry, that's the latest layer. So in this case, components would override themes, would override defaults. And that's no matter what specificity is used for the selectors inside. Specificity only matters inside each layer. So here the override layer wins even though the selector inside of it has a lower specificity than the selector in the framework layer. But we don't necessarily want to have to keep all of our styles in the same order, and that's where it can be useful to define upfront the order that we want and then put code into the layers later. And we can do that either by naming several of them with only a name and no code block, or we can actually use a comma separated declaration here as a shorthand to say, establish the default theme and component layers, and then add more styles to the default theme, default layer. One of the goals here is to make it so that we as authors get to define exactly where third-party tools belong in our layering, no matter what specificity those tools use internally or whatever layers we create. We can always override them without resorting to specificity hacks. So if we're getting a bootstrap component, we can then say where it goes in the layer. This also gives frameworks or component library authors a way to provide layers that we can hook into, either directly by wrapping those layers into a contained namespace. We can either pull them in directly or we can have several stacked. We can create these nested or namespaced layers using a dot notation that combines the name. We can also do it by actually nesting the layer rules. So we can get a little bit complex here and move things around as we need to. This gives us a lot more control over our corner of the cascade. So we're not totally reliant on selector specificity to solve all of our problems, or taking away selector specificity by always using a single class name and then using source order to determine what takes precedence. Here we get to establish it up front and then pull in the styles as we want. And hopefully that allows us to replace all our specificity and important hacks with more clearly defined patterns. Of course, we don't want to pull all of our styles into a layer, and for the sake of progressive enhancement, we likely want to start adding layers to our styles slowly. So unlayered styles will work the same way they always have, and they're going to belong to an implied base layer below all the other layers by default. So by default, layers, we can start using layers to add more detailed, more high specificity things to our styles that older browsers might not see. This is actually a recent change. We had it the other way around. We think this maybe matches better how people will want to do progressive enhancement, but there's also an idea here that maybe we should give authors control over this. So there's an open issue discussing how we might do that. This is sort of the final issue before this feature stabilizes. And if there are any immediate questions on this, I can take them, or I can keep going and come back to questions later. Which is what I'll do. So the next feature is also about how selectors work. With scope, we're trying to address two issues that come up regularly and drive people to use tools and conventions like BEM syntax or CSS and JS. The first goal is to avoid naming conflicts as our projects grow, which we often do by focusing on our second goal, which is to express membership or ownership in our selectors. While nested selectors, ancestor descendant selectors, might seem like a way to express membership, in this case, a title that is inside of a post, post.post.title, that's not quite the same thing as a post title. The first one only describes a nested relationship, but the second one describes a more clear membership in a component pattern, not just all titles that are inside of a post anywhere, but specifically the title of the post. We don't actually have a great way to describe that in CSS currently, unless we invent a new unique name for every kind of title based on what it belongs to. And that's where BEM syntax comes into play, but that's really manual and not exactly what we're trying to, it's not meaningful in the language itself. We can also automate that with JavaScript. And if we want some global title styles, we end up using multiple classes. So we hope that the more targeted class will override the less targeted one, but then we've got this global title and this post title, and we're having to use both of them. Another way to think about this is to say that some components have lower boundaries. The component itself is a donut with a hole in the middle for content. And we should be able to style a tab component or a media object, something like this, without worrying that we might accidentally style everything inside of it by mistake. And this might sound similar to Shadow DOM encapsulation, and there certainly is crossover between scope and Shadow DOM encapsulation. But the Shadow DOM is designed for a more highly isolated widgets, and it creates this one-to-one relationship where boundaries are defined in the DOM in the HTML, and each component has a single scope, and then styles are isolated from getting in or out. While that can be really useful, it's very different from the lighter touch scope that we get from existing build tools and conventions like BEM or CSS modules or view scope styles, etc. In these tools, scope references the DOM using selectors or using single file components, but the scopes are able to overlap and they integrate a bit more smoothly with global design systems. Different styles can be given different or overlapping boundaries, while global styles continue to apply globally. And this provides us with a much lower impact alternative where scopes are defined in CSS and can be reused across components and overlap and cascade together. It's a much more flexible system. So we're proposing an @scope rule, and it might look familiar because there was a proposal in 2014 to do something similar, although I think ours is fairly different. The scope rule accepts both a scope root selector, in this case, the media class, and a lower boundary selector, in this case, the content class. And those can be complex selectors. We can select multiple roots, multiple lower boundaries. Any selector inside the @rule only applies between the root and the lower boundary. So in this case, we're only styling images that are both inside of media, but not also inside of content. We can also talk about this in terms of proximity problem. These two selectors apply to links inside a light theme or dark theme class. And that works great as long as we never nest one inside the other. Since our selectors both have the same specificity and ancestor proximity is not actually part of the cascade, we can get into this situation where the dark theme color always overrides the light theme color when they're nested. And that is not what we want. So we can solve that with lower boundaries so that the themes never actually bleed into each other. But we can also solve that by adding some concept of proximity to scopes. When specificity is equal, we would default to using the closer scope root. And this part of the spec is still being debated, so I'm not sure if this is how it will end up, but I like this idea that we could define two scopes that are very similar, have things with similar specificity inside of them, and whichever is closer to the final link being styled in this case would win. There are a lot more resources that you can look at here. I've got an explainer. The CSS working group has expressed interest, and we just need to start writing the spec and then get feedback on all of the details, sign off on all the details. So if you're interested, feedback is welcome. Chrome is hoping to prototype this soon, but there's a lot to still figure out. And that brings us to the big one. That's probably why we're here, container queries. So you've probably played with media queries plenty, but media queries give us this ability to respond to the size of the viewport, which works great until we throw in a sidebar that's a fixed width, and we have the same component in multiple different layout containers, and we can start to see things break. And right now we have to go in and manually find all these cases and change how something works in a different context, like when we put it in a sidebar, change that. But what we really want is container queries that just allow us to have one component, one set of styles, and they respond to the layout wherever we put them, the context where they are. And that should work even when we're in nested situations. We want that to work anywhere we need it. But there's a little bit of a problem in CSS when we're trying to measure a container and then make changes to its contents based on that measurement. There's a little bit of a paradox in that back and forth. And this actually comes from one of the coolest responsive features in CSS, which we don't talk about nearly enough. Which is just that content and context negotiate a layout back and forth. And while we can impose sizing from the container, we can also allow containers to wrap around their content. And as content changes, the container can as well. So if content changes container and container changes content, we've got a little bit of a potential for looping between the two if we're trying to measure one and change the other. So for a long time, that felt like a blocker. People have been asking for container queries since media queries were invented. But in the meantime, lots of people and browsers have been laying the groundwork to make this possible. And last year, two main proposals emerged showing different ways that we might pull this off. Both are interesting, but David Barron's approach has the most momentum right now. And that's the one that I've been working on and is getting prototyped in Chrome. So the first thing that we need to do is to define our containers. And that's basically anything that we want to be able to measure. And in order to measure it, we have to turn off content sizing. We have to say, this is a container that will not respond to its content sizes anymore. We're going to cut that loop. And that makes it measurable. So we already have a property for this. This is part of the groundwork that's been laid. It's called contain, and it allows us to contain various types of things, including size. So size containment turns off basic content sizing. Layout containment is kind of like a clear fix. It will wrap around floats and margins, so they're not affecting other things on the page. And style containment just makes sure that list counters don't have some unwanted impact. So list counters aren't allowed to leak out either. These are the three types of containment that we need in order to make dimensional container queries work. But 2D size containment is really too restrictive for us to use all the time. Generally in CSS, we want to set either a width or a height, but not both. We want somewhere for extra content to go. It has to be able to expand the box somehow. So we're adding an inline size containment option, and that's also prototyped in Chrome. It seems to be working out pretty well. We're not sure if we can also add block size. If block size doesn't work, we can't add height and width. We have to stick with the logical property. There's just some extra complexity around the way you can affect block padding based on the inline size. You can create extra loops using hacks like that. So right now it's only inline size, but we think that handles most of the use cases. So contain inline size says the contents shouldn't affect, that's usually the width, whatever the inline dimension is, and we can still flex on the other dimension. So it makes one of the dimensions measurable and the other one flexible. In our initial proposal, this was how you created a container, is you just apply the right containment. But as you can see, it's kind of ugly. So it's not really a great path forward. We're going to make all of the articles and talks that have been given on this already out of date by creating some new simpler syntax where you just say what you want to measure, and then the browser figures out what containment is actually required in order to measure that. This is still very much in flux. Some people don't like that container and contain are so similar, so we might have to come up with a new name here for the property. Values might change, but something like this, where we say, I want an inline container. I want to be able to measure its inline dimensions, apply whatever containment in the background is needed for that. Once we have containers, we can start querying them. And a container query is exactly the same as a media query, except it's at container instead of at media. It doesn't have screen and things like that, but at container, and then we can give what we want to query about that container. So min width 40 ems. The big difference here is that with a media query, everything inside of it is looking at the same media. So every H2, every card is going to respond to this in the same way. With a container query, it's a bit different. Each individual card and each individual H2 is going to look at its nearest container and figure out the dimensions of its nearest container and respond to those dimensions. So every card on the page will respond potentially differently. And this is another important part of closing that loop, is that they're all referencing an element outside of themselves. So containers can't query themselves. So we can have containers inside of containers, and we can have containers changing based on a query, but the container in this query cannot query its own containment. It has to query the next one up, the next container up in the DOM chain. So Chrome already has a prototype and you can start playing with it. It's behind a feature flag. You need to download or update Chrome Canary, go to Chrome flags in the URL bar, search for CSS container queries and enable that feature flag, and then restart the browser and this will all start working. It all still currently uses that old syntax where we're listing out the 3 types of containment we need, but that will get updated coming up. So let's actually play around with it. Oh. How do I get the controls out of the way? Okay, great. So here we can see just the difference between the media objects are all understanding that we're on a big screen, but the container responsive ones are responding the way we want. And in the code, that is all happening just with this at container min width 40 ems. And then we change a few styles inside of that. So we can use this for various things. I like this demo by David Heron, showing 3 of the same block quote. And then he has various containers here, article section, which covers all 3 of those areas. And we can see as they get more space, some of them start to go horizontal. And then given the most space, they get this purple clipped layout. And each one is responding to its own container.
Hey, Miriam, I have a question.
Yeah.
Does it make sense for someone to basically make a utility class that's like, you know, doc container, put the containment stuff on it, and then just apply, you know, things as containers across the DOM?
I think it could. I think that's something that we're yet to see. I think also, well, let me show you this demo because I think there's 2 main types of containers that we'll want, which are things like layout containers to say I've got a sidebar, so that's a container. I've got a main area, that's a container. But in some cases, when we're dealing with grid or Flexbox, and this one is a demo of a Flexbox layout, there's not really any parent to measure. When you set Flexbox or you set grid, you create these tracks inside of a larger container, and you really want to be able to measure the track. And that's the one place where this gets a little weird because you need a second element. You need an element in that track that you can measure, and then another element inside of that that can respond to it. So for this sort of card, we're going to have a wrapper card, and then also the article, and we're going to apply the containment or the container property when we can to the outer one, and then the inner one is able to respond to it and change the grid template at different sizes. So in addition to those layout containers, we're also going to want sometimes component containers that sort of like a turtle shell travel with the component. And I don't know if that changes the answer to your question. Maybe those are handled differently. Maybe there's a utility class that can be used for both. Another thing that might change that is we're looking down the road at maybe having named containers and querying specific named containers, which might also change how you handle a utility class. But so you can see in this case, we've got a Flexbox layout. There's small size, larger size, largest size, and then since it's Flexbox, we can have the elements be different sizes, and each one is responding to the space that it has by using that wrapper. Did that answer the question and then also more?
Certainly, I gave a lot more information, but I think, yeah, my initial impression was that you would have to, because of the way that the tracks work in Flexbox and Grid, that you would need to wrap each one of those places as a shell of some sort to measure, and then the component inside of that ends up, you know, adjusting based off of those measurements. So yeah, you have a couple of levels in there, and I imagine that, you know, it's not like a thing like display contents being able to, like, you know, solve all problems here. You know, I'm not saying that display contents would. I'm just saying like a way where you would just measure tracks versus measure, because it seems like much easier to just measure containers because you could apply a container to practically anything, yeah. As opposed to tracks for specifically for Flex and Grid.
Yeah, I would say likely what you're doing for some of the Flex and Grid cases are that you're putting some wrapper around the component itself. I mean, I think That's also what Max Bach does in this bookstore demo. And he's using web components. And one of the interesting choices that he made here is if you have the host of a web component set up as your container, web components sort of always have these two levels already, the host wrapper and then the internal wrapper. And so he's using that to an advantage here for this. So I think that's a pattern that might also emerge in addition to the sort of utility class pattern. Yeah, in this case, in this demo, he's got the same web component here for all of these, just with different content in them. But then when you drag them between the different areas, they get different styling based on where they are, just using container queries. And of course, we don't have to be practical about this. This is a demo from Jay Thompson, where he's showing that the CSS blinds do in fact open cleanly using container queries. And what he's doing here is one wrapping element that you can resize vertically, and then he's changing the elements inside based on that vertical resize. So why be practical when you can have fun with it? And there's a migration path here using at supports. So at rules like containers sort of create their own support true case. Browsers are going to only read what's inside of the container query if they support container queries. But we can also check for, we can use at supports to check the negative case and apply fallbacks. So if something doesn't support contain inline size, this works for now. Then you could apply, say, your old media query or whatever other fallbacks you needed. Of course, down the road, it might become more accurate if we have this new syntax for establishing containers. That's even more likely to be that property will only be turned on once container queries are supported, whereas the contain property might get the inline size value at a different time. And there's more to do here. We're planning on container relative units similar to viewport width, viewport height. We need container width, container height, but we can't call them that because CH is already taken. So some work on the naming to do, but we will get units. And then there's also a lot of interesting ideas about querying. Basically, we're querying elements instead of querying the viewport. So what if we could query other things about them? Can we query the value of a property, the background color? Can we query the value of a custom property? So you could toggle things on and off easily. Can we query the state of something? Is the header position sticky and also in a stuck state? That might be a useful thing to query. So we've got a lot of ideas here, but still need to do some exploration about what exactly can be queried. And then, like I mentioned earlier, named containers. I imagine that one of the use cases for those is we might say we have layout containers and we have component containers. And sometimes, even if the component container is closer, you might want to query the layout container or something like that. Skip over the nearest container and query the state of the header, say, even though you have a container around the search area specifically. So that also needs some work, but I think it'll probably be added. I've got a lot more links here. I shared links to my slides, so you can come back to this. There's my full explainer. The CSS working group project, it's a GitHub project board with all of the relevant issues. And you can read through any of those or contribute if you have thoughts. The technical architecture group review, if you're interested, and then I keep track of a whole list of articles and demos from other people. There are quite a few. So all of these features were designed to work together, building on the existing features of CSS that we talked about and the cascade that holds it all together, but particularly focused on that overlap between the two main goals that I think are the main goals of CSS, making it responsive and making it reusable. And in this case, building components that are inherently responsive and have that the ability to define their responsiveness without reference to external layout structures that they might not understand. So there's already been a lot of progress in this space with tools like Grid and Flexbox and aspect ratios. There's a lot happening sort of in this modular responsive component space. And I think container queries are just going to be another feature that adds into that. To quote Jen Simmons, our medium is not done. Our medium is still going through radical changes. All right, back to questions full time.
I have one that relates to like a practical use case I've run across a few times. And that is this, like dark mode, light mode theming, where you want to respond to a media query by default, but then a user preference is an override, but you have to repeat all of your colors because you can't chain a query and a selector. So in all of this, I'm hearing a lot more queries. Are there ways we'll be able to like sneak a query into that like container selector or that scope query? Will that allow us to reduce repetitious code at all, or?
Well, let's see. If you can query the value of a custom property, then let's say you have a dark mode custom property, -- dark mode, and you set that property using either the media query, preference query, prefers dark mode, prefers color scheme dark. You would only have to change one thing in the two places. And then the rest of it could happen in a container query that says, but yeah, I'm not sure if that's perfect. You would be, if you're querying that on the root, then you have to apply it somewhere else, maybe on the body. So you're defining all your colors on the body. Maybe that's fine. Yeah. So I think it gets you partway there. There is an open issue specifically about that, about can we somehow solve that problem in a more direct way. So I know that on the CSS working group drafts project GitHub board, you can find that issue and dig into it. I can quickly give a sense of where these three are. I don't know if I covered that well. Layers are the farthest along in terms of the specification. So in terms of working group progress, layers are basically done, but nobody started implementing them yet. I expect they will this year, but it hasn't happened. Container queries have this prototype that you can play with, and lots of people are writing articles and demos, but the spec is basically non-existent. We have lots of pseudo spec written, and we're starting to move that into actual specification language. Scope is the farthest behind. There's a lot of interest in it, but there's also just so many different concepts of what scope is and what it should do. And we cannot solve all of them. So we just have to fight through deciding which ones we're going to solve and how. So that's going to be a little bit of a slower process, even though there's a lot of excitement behind it.
Can you tell us how you get involved with something like the CSS core or a working spec for any technology, and if there's not a direct path, at least what your journey was?
Yeah, I wish there was a better path. I mean, I would love if there were some way, some more organized way to bring people in. Right now, my path in was that I proposed something like layers. I didn't know what it was. I said, what if we had something where we could stack our specificities the way that we want to and create sort of custom origins? I hadn't fleshed it out. I just said, this feels like it would be a useful thing. It's a thing that we do in our architectures, sort of carefully lining up specificities. What if we could do it explicitly? And I had an advocate on the working group who said, let's bring in Miriam to do this. I mean, the working group was interested in that proposal, and Jen Simmons was on the working group and suggested that I be invited. It's, unless you can find sponsorship for it, it's a bit of an expensive hobby. Working group doesn't pay anything and has meetings all over the world. And then you pay for your own flights. So I got lucky again that Google was interested in what I was doing in the working group. And they wanted to solve some of these problems and didn't have anybody internally to do it. So they reached out to sponsor my work on some of these things. All of the discussions are open and public, so anybody can get involved that way. I just wish that it didn't rely on also somebody noticing your contributions and explicitly inviting you, and then also you're sort of thrown in, and there are no courses on spec writing. There is just trying to write a spec and having people like Tab and Elika that have been doing it for 2 decades correct your work. That's the course. But yeah, I would start on the CSS working group issues board. CSSWG drafts is the GitHub project, GitHub repo. There are way more issues than you can get your mind around. But if you do searches for things that you think are interesting, like container queries, you can narrow that down, start to find issues that look interesting to you, start following those issues, commenting on them, and participating in the discussion. All of the discussion is open. Even when the working group meets, our notes get posted there. The full transcripts from the meetings. So that's the place to start. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I have a question for Miriam. I was curious, how do you, I know it's hard to predict, but how do you foresee the implementation of the container queries panning out in the other browsers? And do you think that it's something that we could possibly use like this or next year? I'm going to guess it's not something that could be like polyfilled. So just curious.
It can be polyfilled, or at least a chunk of it can. Because we have resize observer, the polyfill would be a little less performant, but Jonathan Neal is working on it. There is already a polyfill out there. It's very early draft, and he doesn't, he panics anytime somebody writes an article about it, but it is there, CQ fill, and he's working on it. In terms of the other browsers, Safari is currently the farthest behind because they don't have containment yet, and they'll need containment in order then to add queries on top. But Igalia, which is this great sort of open source company that contributes to all 3 browsers, or all 3 browser engines that then are many more browsers, Egalia is now working on containment in Safari. So they're getting Safari caught up. I imagine Safari and Firefox, Safari never tells you in advance what they're going to do. So we will not know until it's released exactly when it's coming in Safari. But they have expressed interest. They've been signing off on all of the spec ideas. So we know they're on board. They're not just going to shoot this down. Firefox similarly on board. I expect that likely both of them would start implementing once we have a more solid spec. So they're waiting for us to figure out all these weird details in the prototype. And then once it's in spec language, I expect they'll all come along. So maybe late this year, maybe sometime next year. We'll see.
Yay, thank you.
So the ability to query the value of a property or a custom property opens up toggles. We're changing one custom property, like you mentioned earlier with the theming, light mode and dark mode, where we can have entire blocks of CSS so we toggle on and off. Can you chat a little more about that? If you've got a demo, we'd love to see it.
Yeah, I actually haven't demoed that yet because so the prototype, they started by just sort of naively copying over media queries without any changes. So even some of the, there's some nice features that we're going to get even in the current behavior that will improve. So when you measure ems, for example, on the viewport, you're measuring against default ems, which is the user preference, which is usually 16 pixels. And it doesn't matter what you've set on HTML. But if you added containment to the HTML element, you should be able to query actual font size and respond to actual live ems on the element at the time. And I don't think that works yet because, like I said, they just took media queries and went like, what if we applied that to a container? So right now the prototype is pretty dumb, but all of this is coming. And yeah, in terms of the toggles, I think that's very cool. Leah Veru was working on another path that was specifically for that kind of toggling. And there's an interesting issue thread on the working group GitHub that you can follow that conversation. It seems like this proposal will solve a lot of those use cases potentially, but if not all of them, she may continue to push her other proposal for higher level custom property toggles. Yeah, I think that that is sort of one of the most exciting hidden surprises in container queries. That to me is like, if we can query state and we can query custom properties, that's a lot of power beyond just the responsive design stuff we wanted out of container queries initially.
Alrighty, well, I'll jump in and say thanks so much, Miriam. This has been really informative. I've learned a lot, and the only thing I'm not happy with is that we have to wait so long for some of these to show up. I wish I could have them now. This is fantastic. Thank you for your work with the CSS working group. And thank you for being here tonight to answer some questions and tell us what's coming down the ticket route there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. And all of this, you know, we're looking for feedback as we build it. So that's anybody who wants to jump into those issues and respond, give your thoughts. That's always super helpful.
Cool. Well, to everyone else, thank you so much for attending tonight. Thrilled to have all of you with us. We are, I always like to put this call out, we are booking speakers for the next few months worth of Front Range front-end meetups. So if you've got a talk you're looking to give, even if you're not near Denver, we are going to be remote for a little bit. So feel free to shoot an email to Jason or myself through the frontrangefrontend.com website or by reaching out to us through meetup.com. That would be great. Hope you all have a great rest of your evening. Take care.